Welcome to OutdoorsNB as the 2022 season starts to wrap up. Whether you're sea kayaking, fishing, hunting, we've got another month of hunting left. But as these things start to wrap up, we need to start thinking about what are the things that I need to do to get my paddle craft ready for long-term storage, unless I'm going to be paddling in stuff like this. So we'll go over some of the things we need to do to get our boats ready for storage. Here we go. Hey folks, it's Jeremy Cline with you with OutdoorsNB and Maritime Outdoors and pro staff for Old Town Canoes and Kayaks. Today I want to talk to you a little bit about long-term storage. For many of you, you duck hunt or you fish or you tour or you whitewater with your paddle craft. And it's now, here where I'm at, we're coming on almost Christmas, coming into the Christmas season. And for many, it's time to put your stuff into long-term storage. So we wanted to talk to you about how we can prolong the life of our equipment in how that we store it and how we take care of it when it's in storage, and how we can prepare it for next season as well. There's deformation or changing shape because of improper storage. There's UV damage, both UV hardening and fading. Then there's corrosion, and then we can have animals get at stuff and damage them. So, first off, deformation. How can we prevent long-term these things from deforming as we store them? I'm a simple man, don't want a complication. Linear polyethylene or thermoplastic polymers, which these are, they're polyethylene, high density. The Discovery stuff is a 3-layer with foam in the middle. The thing with linear polyethylene is that heat makes it softer. It's harder with cold. So we want to increase the contact point, essentially, on the storage device. And we want to limit how much weight gets in, on, or in contact with the boat as we store it, because they're designed for the weight of themselves and what you put in them. I just want to add a caveat to that. When the boat's in the water, it's designed to carry the load of itself and what you put in it, because the entire bottom of the hull is in contact with the medium, being the water that it's in, so it spreads the load out. When we store the canoe, kayak, or what have you, all of the weight that's in it, on it, and around it, in contact with it, is going to be supported only by the contact point. And in most cases, that's the rack or whatever it's sitting on. So what does that mean? Let's dive into it a little bit more. We have a 90-pound canoe sitting on a wooden rack made of, let's say, 1x2s. So the 1x2s are supporting 90 pounds. We zoom into each contact point, and there's 4, where the canoe gunnel cap is in contact with the rack. If it's a 1x4, that contact point is roughly 1 inch by 1 inch. So that becomes our contact area, and we times that by 4 because it's in contact, the canoe and the rack, 4 places. So we have each one being 1 inch squared. Multiplying that now by 4 times, we get a total area in contact with the weight of the boat between the boat and the rack of 4 inches squared. That's our total contact area holding the weight of that boat. So now we know our area. Now we can figure out the pressure on the hull. We get our force, which is 90 pounds, by the mass times the acceleration due to gravity. We're going to divide that by the area, and we come up with 22.5 pounds per square inch. Now, if we increase our contact area from a 1x4 to a 2x4, and I've already made the illustration, so I'm not going to correct it, it would be 2 times 1. I'm going to say 2 times 2 for each surface area contact point. And if we pretended that's what it was, 2 times 2, we would come up with a square of 4 inches square for each contact point. So we multiply that by 4, which gives us 16 square inches, and we use the 90 divided by 16, and our result is 5.6 pounds per square inch instead of the 22 and change that we had with the smaller contact area. So if we increase the contact area, we decrease the pressure on the hull as we store our boat. The weight of themselves and what you put in them. And we store them with excess weight. If you store your canoe from the rafters of your garage with a bunch of stuff in it, there's a very likely chance that you're going to damage it over the winter. So don't do that. Don't store stuff in it. So with canoes, the best way to store them is upside down, and we want to have the contact point as wide as possible. We want to spread the weight of the boat out over an area, and that's going to decrease the pounds per square inch, essentially the pressure or force that's on the contact point. The more we can spread it out, the more contact point we have, the less pressure we're going to create on that contact point, and the less likely we are to damage it. Secondly, we want to prevent snow loads, ice, and water. So upside down, it's just going to shed off. And you can see what I've done here. I've built a storage little shed or a shed roof. That's going to keep that stuff off it altogether, and it's also going to prevent the UV damage as well. So upside down with these guys, with a poly sea kayak or a composite sea kayak. A lot of manufacturers recommend storing them upside down. I don't like that because on most of these composite boats, the deck is a little thinner than the hull. The hull is designed to take a little bit more beating because obviously we're going to come into more contact with the beach, with underwater obstructions and things like that. Typically, the hull is a little bit stronger than the deck. So I don't like the upside down idea, but you know, some manufacturers do recommend that, or on their side. They don't recommend upright necessarily for the same reasons. We don't want to fill the thing with water or snow and stuff. And they're stronger on their sides. If you look at this, the shape itself, it's less likely to warp in this fashion than it is to warp in this fashion, right? Just like an I-beam, it's the compression on the top and the tension on the bottom on an I-beam, and I guess it can be similar with this. But on their sides, they're less likely to warp on a sit-on top or a sea kayak. Sit-on tops, ideally, like a canoe, upside down, and you want to support it at its stronger locations where it's flat and where there's a lot of stuff, a lot of extra material, like in corners of the actual cockpit portion of the boat. It's going to be stronger here and out back, but you want to make sure that it's not on rounded edges. You want to make sure that it's being supported on flat surfaces so that we are increasing the contact area, just like with our canoe, just like with our sea kayaks. The greater we can increase the contact area and maintain the shape of the boat in that contact area, the less likely we are to have long-term damage and long-term deformation. We want to control the temperature where we can. Cold's not bad for them at all. It hardens them temporarily. It makes them more dense. Essentially, the density increases just like with liquids. All right. Essentially, water becomes ice as it gets colder. These things get more dense, so they're going to be less likely to deform, especially if we store them properly. But we want to be careful with heat. Excess heat is going to deform them, regardless of how we store them. If we were to heat this too much, it's going to start melting. Right? So we have to think about that. We want to keep them in and around 60, 70 degrees Fahrenheit in that range. Composite boats are not as critical with temperature, but your polymer ones, especially the linear polyethylene ones, thermoset polymers like Ramex and different types of thermoplastic polymers, or thermoset polymers, cross-linked molecular chain. There's different brands and different materials, but there's a whole bunch of that on the market as well. They're less susceptible to temperature damage, heat, and things like that because of the way their molecular bonds are held together. So, deformation. We want to store these guys upside down. These guys upside down or on their side. It's not as great on their side. I'm out of space here to do it, so it's a toss-up, I guess. But they're better upside down. Our racks for when we did retail, we stored them all upside down. And your sea kayaks on their sides. So that's your deformation, long-term storage. Secondly, let's talk about UV damage. I'm a simple man, don't wanna complicate you. So these boats being, as I said, a linear polyethylene and different types of plastic are susceptible to damage from UV light. And the primary source of that UV light is the sun and direct exposure to it. Now you're going to be directly exposing these boats as you use them while they're out on the water. You're also potentially going to directly expose them when they're in storage. So for that reason, we recommend taking this next step both at the end of the season in the fall, early winter, and in the spring as well. We want to reapply. So one thing that we can do, one thing I've already done is I put them under cover. That's going to limit, I'm still getting UV because there's ambient. It's not as much direct sunlight, but it's still getting UV. So put them under cover, like tarps and things like coverings themselves that go directly on the boat. They'll work too, but you have to keep in mind that wind is going to flap that cover against the boat all winter. And it can cause chafing and discoloration over time. So if you're going to wrap them in something, make sure it's tight and maybe even tape it. The issue with that is when it starts to warm back up, you want to take that off as quick as you can because you're essentially creating a greenhouse effect with your boat. And when these things come from Old Town, from the factory, they're wrapped in clear plastic. And there's warnings all over them to take the plastic off immediately because they act as a greenhouse. And like we talked with the deformation damage, we're heating these things up to temperatures potentially that can soften them and deform them. So we want to be careful of that. If you're going to wrap them, if that's going to be your method to prevent UV damage, make sure when it starts to warm back up that you take them off. That's important. Okay? But you can wrap them, you can put them under cover, you can do both. And one really simple solution, many manufacturers, composite boats, same thing. We'll use this different products, but what I have here is 3M 303 protectant. In Canada you can find it all over the place, hardware stores, whatever it is, the Canadian Carrot one that sells tires, has tire in the name. You can get it there, you can get it all over the place, but 3M 303 protectant, you can get it online as well. You're going to spray that. It's essentially, we don't need to wax these things, but we should be doing this. So we're just going to spray all over, and we want to make sure that the whole hull gets a good coating of this, and that's creating a barrier that's going to prevent UV light from damaging the hull, and it actually makes it look really good as well. It shines it right up. This stuff will work, obviously, four-wheelers, if you've got plastic and you don't want it to fade. This stuff will work with that as well. We're going to put it on our plastic canoes, our plastic sit-on tops, our plastic sea kayaks. Everything that is susceptible to UV damage, you can use that stuff on it, and it's going to protect it for an amount of time. So we kind of recommend, and most manufacturers recommend, in the fall and again in the spring before you take it out, you start using it. You can reapply it, and that's going to protect it while you're using it on the water as well. And that's going to bring the life of these guys to 25, 30, 40 years instead of 10 to 15. With one of the things that happens, you have fading and you have UV hardening. And I talked about the cold not really being a bad thing for these things, but when you UV harden it and then you go to use it, it's become brittle. So these things are known, the Discoveries are known for taking a beating, bouncing back into shape and keeping going. If you UV harden that and you deform it, there's a very good chance it's not going to deform anymore, it's just going to crack because it's so hard. So we want to prevent that from happening by protecting it from the UV that's going to harden it. Okay? So that's step number 2 is UV damage. Your best bet is to cover it with 303 protectant or something similar that has UV protectants in it, UVA and B. And I'm going to put that on all of my stuff when I store it. Right? So that's our UV issue. Number 3, we talk about corrosion. I'm a simple man, don't want a complication. So for boats that have metal hardware, when you go to store it and when you go to take it out and use it, you want to use some kind of a anti-corrosion spray. You don't want something that's going to mess up the rest of your gear, but you want to, stainless stuff. If it's a really high-grade stainless, you don't have to really worry about it. You can use that if it's a good stainless 316L, 402 will stain a little bit, but your 316s, your marine grade stuff, That's not going to rust. We don't have to worry about it too much. But where we do want to really concentrate on preventing corrosion, preventing rust is really important, is rudder cables and things that transfer into the hull and have tubes that water can sit in. So I'll show you something here. What we have here is an Old Town Sportsman Big Water 132 PDL with a rudder. Stainless steel cable runs in through a tube here. There's a flange and then a tube that runs through so water doesn't get in the hull. Essentially, we run our tube to our rudder actuator. What can happen here in fresh water, we can get mineral buildup in there. In brackish and salt water, we can get, obviously the mineral salt can build up in here. It's not necessarily going to corrode this, but it can, depending on what grade stainless is used in that cable. So what most manufacturers recommend is spraying a silicone-based lubricant into there, and that's going to displace the water and kind of prevent that water buildup. Water can build up in there, evaporate, and the mineral deposits can build up. In the wintertime, it can freeze and crack our tubes, which will result in water getting in the hull when we go to use it the next season. So you just want to line up that, if you have a tube on your spray actuator, line it up with the hole, spray in there. I'm going to do that in both spots. And that's just going to help prevent water buildup. One thing that you want to check your manufacturer's recommendations on whatever model, make, manufacturer you have. Most do not recommend putting lubricant in if you have a rope-based system that goes into your hull, because that can swell the rope and then it can jam up. So you want to be careful on that. Make sure you do whatever the manufacturer recommends there. I know with stainless stuff, recommend silicone-based spray. For kayaks designed for use on the ocean or sea kayaking, most are set up with stainless hardware. So really the only thing we have to do here is actually come off the water. Same thing with most of the fishing stuff from Old Town. It's all high grade stainless. Just want to rinse it with fresh water. I'm a simple man, don't want to complicate you. And lastly, we want to prevent animals from damaging our boats. So with boats with a cockpit, or like with the Sportsman and sit-on tops, we want to limit access to seats and things with fabrics on them, because rodents will oftentimes use that for nesting. So if you're going to store your sit-on tops and stuff outside, you want to remove the seat, remove all the stuff you can, and put that into a safe winter storage location. With our with our sea kayaks, one of the things we can do, apart from where we store it, if we're going to store it outside like I do under cover with my composite boats here, we put a cockpit cover on, and that's going to prevent animals from getting in there. It's going to prevent, if we get sideways, like Forrest Gump, sideways rain, it's not going to get in there and create ice issues. So lastly, to prevent rodent issues, we put cockpit covers on and remove what we can from our boats and things like that. Remove access. If you have a canoe with aftermarket seat pads and stuff, you want to remove that stuff and put it away for the winter. One other thing I'll touch on with regard to sea kayaks, and I haven't done it right here right now. I'm probably going to leave it as is for the winter, but when you're storing these guys, especially in the summertime, it's very wise to pop the hatches off and put them inside. Actually, I will do that with this because I had it that way before. We're going to pop our covers in, and that's going to prevent them from stretching, for one, over time, and it's going to prevent temperature changes from increasing and decreasing pressure in each compartment, which can really wear on our gasket, like the seals of our bulkheads. If the pressure gets too great, it can do damage in that regard. But primarily, it's going to stretch your hatch cover seals, so we want to prevent that. So I'll just pop them off and store them in the boat. And it's okay because I've got this under cover, it's under an overhang, so I'm not going to get moisture. And I do come in and check this every so often just to make sure that I don't have water in there. You do not want to let water sit on the inside of a composite boat because it will delaminate the layers over time. So pop these hatches off and store them inside the boat. Just make sure no liquid gets in it. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it. Thanks for watching.